Good evening, welcome. It's nice to see you in the sunlight. So tonight we're starting a five-part series. I'll be doing 3 of the classes and Reverend Albert will be 2. I'll be doing the first 2, he'll be doing the second 2, and I'll be doing the last 1. And this is part of, it's in sort of in honor of Women's History Month, but also the church has a notable the Women of Note program, and so we're trying to tie in with that. And the 5 individuals that we're going to be doing, to some degree, all have a religious connection. And the lady we'll be starting with tonight definitely does. I would, of the 5 we're doing, I would imagine that Simone Weil is probably one that most people have probably not heard of. But she's a very interesting combination of a mystic and political activist. When you put those 2 together, it's an interesting combination. So she was a French philosopher, mystic, and as I said, political activist. She was born February 3rd, 1909, into a family of agnostic Jews. So it was a Jewish family that was really what we would call non-religious. Sometimes secular Jew is used. So there's the identity with the Jewish community, but agnostic at best. At 6 months of age, she suffered a severe attack of appendicitis. And from that point on, her life was always one of poor health. She continually had poor health throughout her life. Her brother, André Weil, was a very well-known mathematician and famous for his work in number theory and algebraic geometry. So she was from a family of intellectuals, and she was an intellectual herself. But early on, she became, as one of her biographers said, obsessed with cleanliness. Obsessed with cleanliness. And in later life, she'd sometimes speak of her disgustedness, especially in the way she looked, and the way she thought she looked in the way people saw her. She was very affectionate. She had a very close relationship with her father. But after he left, and after he died, I should say, she tended to always avoid physical contact with either male or female. These are some little interesting quirks about the person. According to her, one of her major biographers, Simone, early in life she decided she had to adopt masculine qualities. And from her late teenage years on, she would adopt a masculine appearance, often wearing what would be considered masculine clothes, never wore makeup, never tried to look attractive in that quote-unquote common female sense of things. The other thing, from very young age, she strongly identified with the disadvantaged of the world. Apparently when she was just 6 years old, in 1915, she refused to have sugar in solidarity with troops on the Western Front. Why these are sort of interesting, why these things occur, especially at early ages, sort of a mystery. But she, right from an early age, she always tended to identify with the disadvantaged. But she was a precocious student, very, very bright. By the age 12, she'd become proficient in ancient Greek. By the age of 12. She later learned Sanskrit on her own, so that she could read the Bhagavad Gita in its original. So an interesting, when you look at all these factors as a young person, the intellectual precociousness, the feeling about her body not being good, her association with the disadvantaged, how do these all come together to make a life? And that's what we'll be talking about. She also, from an early age, took great interest in the world's religions in general, and attempted to understand each religion as an expression of transcendent wisdom. Her secondary studies were at a very well-known, what we'd call sort of prep school in France, the Lycée Henri IV. She came under the influence of this philosopher. See, it's interesting. In France, even to teach at high secondary schools, you have to be very well educated. So you can find philosophers teaching at second, where here you'd only think of them teaching at colleges. So she came under the influence of this man, and he's a very famous philosopher and a journalist. He was also a pacifist. His name was Émile Chartier. He's known by his name Alain, if you ever want to look him up. So she was making an attempt to get into the highest intellectual institution in France. That's the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. All the intellectuals of French, all the French intellectuals go there. So she was taking her exam and she failed for her low marks in history. But on her second attempt, you get more than one attempt, in 1928, she was successful in gaining admission. And she studied there, and this is the famous École Normale Supérieure. She finished first in her class in the exam on philosophy and logic. Finished first. What's interesting, who finished second? I don't know if you know this lady, Simone de Beauvoir, very famous French philosopher, companion of Jean-Paul Sartre. If you want to read about an interesting relationship, there are books about that. But anyway, she finished ahead of Simone de Beauvoir. And so then she studied her philosophy. She earned in what would be equivalent to an MA in 1931. It was also during that time she began to get some fairly radical political opinions. And there was a name that was used throughout the university. They called her the Red Virgin, because she was very influenced by Karl Marx. And the virgin side, well, from her earlier non-identification with anything sexual. Then she passed what is known as her agrégation. That is a very competitive examination that allows you to teach in a public school. If you don't pass, and it's a high-level exam. If you don't pass that, you can't teach in the public schools. So the public schools in France and in Europe in general have always been at a much higher level than what we have found in the United States. And so she passed that, and she got a teaching degree at a place called Le Puy. And while she was teaching there, she became involved in local political activity by supporting the unemployed and striking workers. So she was teaching, but also contributing to her political activism. She never officially joined the French Communist Party. Many of the French intellectuals actually joined the French Communist Party. She didn't do that. And she became increasingly critical of Marxism in the next few years. And she, according to her biographer, Peter Moss, she was the first to identify a new form of oppression, not anticipated by Marx, where the elite bureaucrats can make life just as miserable for ordinary people as the capitalists. The elite bureaucrats. And I think so in 1933, she took part in a major French strike, a general strike. You know what a general strike is? A general strike is when all the unions join in. I don't know that we've ever had a general strike history. Here, most of the strikes are individual union. Australia used to have general strikes. That's what gave the union movement its power. If one union went out, the others would go out in support. So she participated in this. And it was based on unemployment and wage cuts. So again, she was involved in this activity. Then she decided to take a 12-month leave of absence from teaching to go work in factories. Her reasoning was, if she was supporting these people up here, she should be living their life, or knowing what it was like to be a worker in a factory rather than just an intellectual talking about workers in factories. You see the distinction? So she took this seriously. So for 2 years, she worked at a couple of main factories, one by Renault, the French car maker Renault. We say Renault, but Renault. And because she had physical problems to start with, it really took it out of her. She got quite ill. It exhausted her, and she had to take about 6 months off after working in the factories before going back to teaching. She resumed teaching, and then most of her income she donated to political causes or charities, so she lived very meagerly. And then, although she was a declared pacifist, she traveled to Spain to join in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side. That was the non-fascist side. Franco was the fascist leader, so she was. And she joined one of the largest anarchist military units, which had 6,000 members. She carried a rifle, as you can see, but she had terrible eyesight. And so her comrades tried to avoid taking her out on operations. Yeah. Why was she there if she's a pastor? Well, she supported very much the Republican cause. But she became very distressed with the killings that were going on both sides. Especially she saw a 15-year-old executed by her comrades. And this sort of shook her up. While she was with the group, she burned herself over the cooking fire. She was a bit clumsy. And she had to leave the unit and was met by her parents, who took her out of the country to recuperate in Italy in Assisi. Has anyone ever been to Assisi? Beautiful little Tuscany town. Of course, Assisi we identify with St. Francis. A month after her departure, the unit that she was with was nearly wiped out. Every woman in the group was killed. It's those little contingencies, things that happen. She burned herself on a fire, mistakenly. She has to leave. She's not there when the unit gets. And Chris and I are reading a book right now. It's called Fluke. And it's based on that whole theme of chance and chaos that we don't recognize, how often we don't recognize it and the impact it has. Just a quick little aside about that. Kyoto was going to be the first town bomb, atomic bomb. It was scheduled to have the first atomic bomb. 20 years earlier, I forget his first name, Stinson, who was there with his wife and fell in love with Kyoto. He then became Secretary of War. When he saw that city was on the list, he argued against it vehemently. It was changed. So these are the things that we often don't notice in history. We're often looking for the big causes, the big events. Burning yourself, in any case. But that led her to go. She was in Assisi, and she went to the Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli. This is the basilica where St. Francis, he wasn't St. Francis at the time, had his early vision. And lo and behold, she has a vision while she's praying at this church. And she was led to pray for the first time in her life. Now this is interesting. This is an intellectual, very much a head person. she was raised in an agnostic intellectual family. She didn't have much, she was interested in religion, always studied it, but from up here. What makes her religious, this is a turning point, is not thought, it was an experience in this basilica. She experienced, she said, the presence of Jesus. Like I said, she'd been born into a secular Jewish household. In her autobiography, she says that as a teenager, she considered the existence of God and said she couldn't know one way or another. That's sort of the intellectual approach. I can't know, and if you're honest, you can't know. So she was an agnostic. But she said she always had a Christian outlook, meaning she was always impressed by Jesus of the Gospels, especially the Sermon on the Mount and his caring for the poor and the dispossessed. She'd always been attracted to that. Now remember, she's Jewish, but she's not religiously Jewish. She actually became first attracted to the Christian faith in 1935. She was on a holiday in Portugal when she was moved by the beauty of villagers singing hymns in procession. Okay? That's the ceremonial, ritualistic side of religion, which we often miss. We're so much up here. We often think of religion in terms of beliefs. Early religion, belief was always second or third. What was primary was what you'd call faith or belief, but also ritual, where you're actually involved with something that your body's involved with. Okay? When you think of ritual, you don't think of thinking. You're involved with some action. And so she was attracted to that. Then she read, a year after her experience in Assisi, she read a poem by George Herbert called Love Tree. And then she said, she felt Christ come down and take possession of me. Again, a type of religious experience from a person you probably wouldn't expect, if you just knew her from early on, to be that. She was an intellectual. She was a political activist, but she was an intellectual and continued to be an intellectual. But from this point on, her writings became what we call both mystical and spiritual, while never getting rid of that social and political awareness. So she was trying to meld together this mystical experience with political activism. And to her, it was quite obvious. It was Jesus. He had mystical experiences, and he was an activist. He was helping the dispossessed. So that became her model, although she didn't convert. She didn't convert to Catholicism. She had some, and I'll mention them, some important contacts, priests, who wanted her to convert, but she said she could not convert primarily because she wanted to remain outside it because of the love of those things that are outside Christianity. She had these other connections, especially with other religions, so she felt she couldn't convert to a specific religion, but she was a follower of Jesus. Does that make her a Christian? Well, I mean, that's just an intellectual question. So it depends what your definition of a Christian is. But if you look at what her life was about, I would definitely say so. So during World War II, she actually received spiritual direction from this father, Joseph Marie Perrin. She became very close with him. A lot of discussions about Catholicism. He was always trying to get her to take that extra step, and she never did to this point. And as I said, she didn't limit her curiosity to Christianity. She was very much interested in early Greek religion, in the Egyptian mysteries, in Hinduism, in Mahayana Buddhism. And she thought they all contained elements of genuine revelation. She was, however, and this is crucial, this is interesting. It's a little bit, well, let me try. She was opposed to what she called religious syncretism. Do you know what syncretism? Something that's syncretic is when you bring everything together and blend it. Okay? She didn't think all the religions should just sort of take a little bit from this, a little bit from that, a little bit from that, and make a blend. She didn't like that. She thought that every individual religion had its own particular perspective, which should not be given up. In this regard, she wrote, this is it, each religion is alone true. That is to say, that at the moment we are thinking of it, we must bring as much attention to bear on it as if there were nothing else. It's called perspectivism. This is the Christian perspective. When I'm studying Christianity, that's where I am. I see it just from this point of view. That doesn't mean I can't accept there are other perspectives doing the same thing, and we can talk to one another, but we're not going to put ourselves in a blender and mix it up. I think Albert was talking about this at one time. The early interfaith movement tended to be synchronistic. We'll blend everything together. We won't say where we're different because we don't want to offend. This allows for both, if you think about it. And this is what actually scholars are trained, anthropologists who study religion are trained to do. When you go study, for example, Hinduism, you have to do the best you can to put yourself just in that Hindu perspective, if you want to understand it. Otherwise, you're always going to be understanding it from the outside. It doesn't mean you have to believe it. It's a difficult task at times. But this is what she meant. That each religion in itself spoke to truth. All of you are looking at me from a different perspective, aren't you? All your perspectives are true. Do you get that? From that perspective, it's true. From that perspective, it's true. But his perspective from there isn't true. It's an interesting way to think about things. Different perspectives can be true. We tend to think there's only one perspective. In any case, so in 1942, she goes to the United States to take her family out of Europe, because what's going on in 1942 in France, okay? She had been reluctant to leave France, but she agreed to do so because she wanted her parents to be safe, and she knew that they would not leave without her. So she goes to the United States for a short period of time. She also is encouraged by the fact that it would be relatively easy for her to come back to Britain from the United States, where she wanted to join the French resistance. The French resistance was an underground movement fighting against the Nazis and the regime that was pro-Nazi in France. So she wanted to join that. Again, interesting combination. And she came back to London, and she was hoping to be sent to France as a covert agent. James Bond. Back in London, she joins what were known as the Free French. The Free French were de Gaulle had left France and come a government in exile in England, because after the Nazis invaded, the government in power was pro-Nazi. The Free French had come to England, and so she joined that. And then she had a lot of time on her hands, so she started to write. And we're going to be looking at a few of her books. The first one was called The Need for Roots. I'll say more about this in a bit. But for the moment, it diagnoses the causes of the social, cultural, and spiritual malaise which she saw afflicting the entire 20th century. Maybe you've experienced that, this sort of malaise, okay? The lack of roots. And I'll get back to a little more detail later. There's some thought, it's not quite clear because this was secret, that she was being recruited by special operations to be sent to France as a clandestine wireless operator. Some evidence towards that. And there were preparations to train her, but then she became very ill. In 1943, she was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And so she was instructed to rest, eat well, and try and get better. Now this is interesting, and there's been a lot of debate, and I'll talk about it shortly. She refused special treatment because of her long-standing idealism and her detachment from material things and identity with those who didn't get the treatment. That's an interesting position. If you know that you're the one that's getting it, someone else can't get it. And anyway, that was the type of person she was. Yeah. Yeah, the Chicago Bears running back. Yeah, he was on the list to get a liver transplant. And because he was so well known, they were going to put him ahead. He said, no, I can't do that. And he died of liver disease. I'll think of his name by the end of it. There's no doubt about it. If you're a celebrity or if you're well known, that's the way the world works. But she didn't want to work, and we'll see why, because I get into her thinking. She didn't want to operate the way the world operated. In any case, so she stopped eating. Again, there's some debate as to why. And she died at the age of 34. 34 years old. The coroner's report said this: the deceased did kill and slay herself by refusing to eat while the balance of her mind was disturbed. That was the coroner's report. The cause of her death remains a subject of debate. Some claim her refusal to eat came from her desire to express solidarity with the victims of the war. There's some who take that position. Some say she was influenced by this philosopher, Arthur Schopenhauer, who in his chapters on saintly asceticism described the act of self-starvation as an exalted method of self-denial. But her biographer, the one that I mentioned earlier, Simone Petremont, regards the coroner's report as mistaken, basing her opinion on letters written by the personnel of the sanatorium where Weil was treated, affirming that she was asking for food on different occasions and even ate some a few days before her death. So according to Petremont, it was Weil's poor health that made her unable to eat rather than unable to eat. So it's a mixture of cause and effect. Which was the cause, which was the effect? If you've ever been really ill, you might know your appetite sometime. You almost had to be forced to eat. So that could have been it. But she had this ascetic side to her, so it remains a bit of a mystery. In any case, I want to now move forward to some of her works. And let me just start by, before dealing with any specific works, looking at some of the major themes that you find in all three of these. Because she wrote 4 or 5 books. One of the major themes is absence. A-B-S-E-N-C-E. She believed that God created the universe, this is an interesting creation theory, by an act of self-delimitation. In other words, she argued that because God is utter fullness or perfect being, no creature can exist except where God is not. If the creature could exist where God is, that creature would be the same as God. What distinguishes creatures from the Creator is that the Creator backs up, creates a space for creatures, but God is not in that space. This creation myth actually goes back to the Jewish Kabbalah, or mysticism, whereby God began the process of creating by spreading his infinite light and then withdrawing so that creatures could exist. It varies a bit with the traditional notion of creation, where you say, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. But how good? Was it as good as God? Can't be, by definition, in traditional theology. There has to be a separation. And this is her notion of absence. The absence of God, not totally, but partially, creates the ability for there to be human beings. Otherwise, everything would be God. There would be no creation. There would just be God. This is interesting. I'm not saying this is true. These are just her way. Because one of the major problems in Christian theology is called theodicy. How do you explain evil? How do you explain evil from an all-good, all-loving, all? And so this fits into that. Because humans are born in an alienated position, meaning they're not perfect. They can't be perfect. Otherwise, they would be God. Now, this is one way of looking, quote unquote, at original sin. Not something that was done wrong, but just the fact that you're not God. And when you're not God, you are separated from God. There is a sense of absence. And what we call evil is just the extreme of that absence. But it's never absolute. So this is where absence becomes a very much part of the way she looked at things. You can only have a lover when you're absent from that lover. It's the longing to be with the beloved. If there's no absence, there's no love. I'm not saying this is true, but do you see the reasoning behind it? How can I love someone if I am that person? I have to have separation. Separation is absence. So this is the basis of one of her parts of her theology. So evil is present in the world just by definition. And all evil is the extreme of that separation. Theologically, the way that will be recuperated is the incarnation. God will, in Christian theology, fill that area with Jesus. That's what makes the connection possible. If there's no Jesus, from a Christian point of view, you would not know God. Or if there's no Buddha, you would not know the Buddha nature. If there's no Muhammad, you will not know Allah. It's this need for an intermediary to to close that absence to some, never totally, but to close it. So that's the basis of her theology. It's sometimes called a negative theology, not meaning not good, but looking at things from absence, from lack, rather than positive fulfill. It's only because of lack that you can have connection. We often don't think of the negative that way, do we? Negatives generally are something that but if you don't have the negative, you'll have no desire for the positive. I can see you're all agreeing with this. In any case. And she says that what drives people towards God are the evils of the world. If everything was hunky-dory, if everything was perfect, there'd be no need for that connection. So this, she writes, well, okay, so that's the second one then is, well, that's God's, is affliction, which she knew a lot about. This is her second major theme. This is more than just simple suffering. Affliction is extreme suffering. And she says only some souls are capable of experiencing the full depth of affliction. But those souls, she says, are also the ones that can experience extreme joy. It's again working off this negative principle. If you are deeply afflicted, then you will require extreme joy. If you're just suffering a little bit, you usually, you go to the doctor. When you're suffering deeply, you got to find something greater than that. So affliction is a very much, and she says that affliction, therefore, can be liberating. This is her notion of the transcendent. That we have, what we really want is to identify with the transcendent, but we're stuck in this world. And the world is very tempting to bring us to its ends and its goals and its understandings. This is what you do if you want to be successful. This is what you do. Da-da-da-da-da. Whereas her notion is, that's the wrong goal. Now this is a religious goal. The religious goal is a transcendent one. So she says, this is how affliction. And what are the two classic examples of affliction? War and oppression. And that's why one of the reasons she went to war. She wanted to experience that affliction. That's why she identifies with the oppressed. She wants to experience that oppression. For what purpose? To bring her closer to her God.
Did she succeed before she died?
We don't know.
She didn't write about
Well, she wrote a lot about it. No, she would have never said, she would have said, I'm on my way. But her goals were always, and if you look at her choices were generally not in favor of her worldly success. That's how you can tell, right? What does she choose to do? Even when she's on her deathbed, she's not saying, "Give me the best doc, give me the best, get me to UCLA, get me here. I need to live." She said, "Okay, it's more important for me to identify with everyone else who's dying. Why should I be special? It's not that doesn't sell well in the world." Okay? But where did she see this? Who was her? That's what she saw in Jesus. Jesus didn't run away from being crucified. He was crucified. Why? The people in the world would say because he was stupid. Right? That's the worldly view. But he was living in a different dimension. And that's what she's trying to do. What we call this spiritual dimension. Okay? And it doesn't speak to a lot of people today because we live in a very secular society where we don't understand that dimension very well. Or if somebody's claiming it, we think, oh, geez, call Dr. So-and-so, let's get an appointment. Okay. But, throughout most of European history, that's the dimension that people were living in or striving to live in. And so that's... but what's interesting about affliction, she says it comes from both necessity and chance. Affliction is necessary because we all experience it. It's equivalent to the Buddhist notion that suffering is. Okay, so the first noble truth. Life contains suffering. That's the necessity. You don't have any choice about that. You don't have any choice about whether you're going to get sick. You might try and fix yourself. You don't have any choice about getting old. You don't have any choice about dying. Those are the givens. And we see those as afflictions. Most people don't like to be sick. Most people don't like to be getting old. Most people probably say, I can die, but not tomorrow. Okay? So that's the part that's just part of the system. That's part of creation, if you want to look at it from a Christian point of view. It just is. That's the necessary part of affliction. We're all afflicted at some level. It depends what you do with that affliction. Do you see it as, got to make it better? She says, well, yeah, but it can also point you in another direction, because the answer isn't here. Here we all end up in the same place. The ultimate affliction. But then there's some by chance. Sometimes there's just chance afflictions, like the one I mentioned. Things just happen. We always want a major reason, but sometimes there is no reason, or any reason we can see. Sometimes things just happen. And you've probably seen that. I won't use the word necessary, but it starts with an S, ends with a T, and has a high in the middle of it. Happens. You ever seen that on cars? That's what it's meant. Sometimes things just happen. It's not your fault. It just happens. Those are afflictions by chance. But for her, affliction can be a source of higher knowledge. That's her point. If everything's going well, if you're always 100% whatever, you'll probably have no need to look for something higher. It's only when you experience that affliction that you might turn in that direction. She also has the theme of the beautiful, by the way. She says, beauty is the inherent form of the world, proven to her by geometry and all good art. But it is the proof, and this is what is key, the world points to something beyond itself. The beauty of so it's an interesting combination. Affliction points towards something beyond itself, but so does beauty. Those are two paths. And for her, the ultimate beauty is the incarnation. Jesus' incarnation. Because it's in the flesh. That's what incarnation means. Incarnate. Carne is meat, or in Spanish, right? Incarnation. That's the ultimate beauty of the world, when you see the divine in the flesh. And not what we would call beauty of the flesh, like a model or something. The beauty in the flesh that is acting in a certain way. And that's the way of Jesus. That's the beauty of Jesus. But she said again, that points to something beyond. That points to something beyond. She says, Christ, is really present in the universal beauty. The love of this beauty proceeds from God dwelling in our souls and goes out to God present in the universe. So God is, going back to the beginning, there's absence, but the presence is in the form of a body. Jesus wasn't just some abstract spirit. We tend to think maybe of him that way. He had a body. He was incarnate. And we saw his beauty in the way he acted, according to Simone. Okay, let's turn more specifically to her books. I mentioned The Need for Roots, published in French in 1949. Published posthumously. All of her stuff was published after she died. And it was largely the work of those two Catholic priests who helped her. The work diagnoses the causes, like I said, of this malaise of the time, particularly in Europe, but also throughout the world. Uprootedness is defined as a near universal modern condition. Universal modern condition resulting from the destruction of ties to the past and the dissolution of community. Communities falling apart. The institutions that keep us grounded are coming apart. Whether it's family, whether it's church, these are coming apart in the modern world. And it discusses all these currents and suggestions of what people need to lead fulfilling, joyful, and morally good lives. These include a belief in a transcendent and universal source of good. If you don't believe that, then what defines good? What my group wants, what I think, what power has. This says we have to have something that transcends, that defines what is good, not just what I think or what I want. Because without that, you tend to get this complete dissolution and conflict. So that's one thing. That's not the only thing. She says there must be respect for spiritual traditions, the various religious traditions of the world, and a commitment to loving one's neighbor. Does this sound familiar? And then finally, hope and trust in the future. If you lose transcendence, if you lose love of neighbor, if you lose the sense of hope in the future, what are you left with? And she says, if you look around, that's what's going on in the modern world. And people are then reaching out, grasping for things to try and hold on to something, usually the wrong things. Drugs, sex, and rock and roll. Okay, which might last for a little while, but they have no transcendent element, and therefore, if it doesn't have a transcendent element, according to her, it will not last. It will not last. And then there's this book. This is I really like this one. It's called Gravity and Grace. It was the first of her books to be published in English. Early in 1942, just before going from France to New York, she gave a copy of the book to Gustave Thibron, one of her advisors, and said, read it and take care of it during my absence. And it contained a dozen thick exercise books in which she was recording her daily thoughts. So it's sort of like her diary. After her death, Thibron, as the literary executor, selected certain representations from this big collection and published it as Gravity and Grace. Interesting title, right? The opening sentences explain the title and establish the basic conviction of her religious thought. So here it is. All the natural movements of the soul are controlled by laws analogous to physical gravity. Grace is the only exception. We must always expect things to happen in conformity with the laws of gravity unless there is a transcendent intervention. Gravity is Weil's spiritual vocabulary for the evil to which human beings are prone. What does gravity do when you think of it? It brings you down, down. It's a force which draws always downward and keeps one down even when it would want to rise. Ask an addict. Okay? Even when you want to rise, that gravity will tend to pull you down. Grace is the opposing force which alone can make possible by its presence the liberation and ascent of the soul. I think Elbert would like this. Now, the book explores how these two forces operate in human life. There are numerous sections entitled Illusions, Idolatry, Violence. What are they examples of? Gravity. Other sections, Love, the Cross, Beauty, Grace. Now, in formulating the laws that are operative, she frequently employs metaphors taken from the physical sciences. Like gas. An expansive soul tends to fill an entire space given to it. But also like a gas, when the soul contracts, it leaves a vacuum. And human will alone cannot fill the void. This is very Protestant. Actually, it's Catholic Protestant, but the notion that human will is not enough. There has to be something which she labels grace, which is hard to define except you experience it. You don't think it, you don't even will it. And all you have to do is ask someone who's experienced it to tell you that it can have a profound impact. It's the one thing that can raise you. So this is interesting. Her view is fundamentally Platonic, like Plato's. Do you know Plato's analogy of the cave? I'm here, but if you couldn't see me, and Jerry had a projector back there and was shining the light, but what would you see up there? You'd see my shadow. You wouldn't see me. You'd see but what would you think? You would think that shadow was real. She said, this is the problem. We think the immanent is ultimately real, but it's the transcendent that's real. And we get caught up with identifying with the immanent, with the worldly things. It's just a fundamental ignorance of reality. When you remember, this is a French intellectual. This isn't some person just making this up. Okay? She's thought about this a lot. She's read Plato. She understands, and it grasps her. Yes, that's it. We're all running around like shadows. And Plato says if you stand up and turn around and look backwards, you'll see the truth. The transcendent reality behind all things, which she identifies with God. God is the transcendent reality behind all things, who creates the world, backs up, allows us to be, but that allowing us to be always leaves a longing within us. This sense of alienation, of absence, that we try and fill up in all sorts of different ways. And she says the ultimate way only is through grace and connection with the only thing worthwhile being connected to. Everything else changes. Everything else doesn't last. Everything else is temporal. We don't like that. So what do? We try and grab onto those things as hard as we can. But underneath, we all know. We all know. In any case, so this is this wonderful comparison. Gravity tends to bring us down. The world tends to bring us down. Grace, the transcendence, allows us to rise up. But as a result, we're often going to be seen in the eyes of the world as what? Foolish. Foolish. what is important here is that we become empty of personal ego. Empty of personal ego. We have to, quote unquote, disappear. We have to become absent from our ego. Because our ego will always keep us attached. And I'll tell you, the ego doesn't go down easily. That ego will fight till the very last moment. It will fight. And there's some reasoning behind this, evolutionarily wise, and allows you to survive, etc. But at the spiritual level, that becomes, if you want to use the quote, the devil, not as a horn being, but that which is always calling you to be your ego rather than your transcendent self. She says this is interesting, and this was developed also by some Japanese Buddhist philosophers at Kyoto University. Christ emptied himself. He became empty. We often call it he became transparent. He gave of himself completely. He completely emptied himself. And she says that we need to follow that example to whatever degree we can and empty ourselves. This is called, in Christian history, following the way of Jesus. It can be dangerous because if I say, well, I'm following Jesus, I'm living Jesus, then what can someone in power say? That is hubris. You can't be Jesus. Okay? So there's that fine line. But she wanted to live that life of emptying herself. Of emptying herself. And she says, there's a paradox. When you empty, you become full. It's one of those strange. When you empty yourself of ego, it leaves a void. And what fills it? God's grace. So grace doesn't just come without you doing anything. You have to empty yourself. You can't, if I have a glass of something and it's filled, I can't pour anything more in it. I have to empty it. When you empty it, then it will be filled. That's grace. Okay, her last book is called Waiting for God. Yeah, we're almost done here. This was a collection of letters and essays that were compiled again after her death in 1943. And they talk about her relationship with religion. She had a conflicted relationship with religion in the institutionalized sense. Okay. This was not intended for publication, but it was published. That often happens once you've had a few books out. And it begins with a series of letters exploring her distance from and disagreements with Orthodox Catholicism. So it's talking about a lot of her conversations with Perrin, and they're always trying to get her to make the last step, which there's some biographers said at her deathbed she did, but that's not completely known. Then she follows this with a series of essays exploring the Catholic commandment to love thy neighbor. What does that mean? She also explores what she calls the just balance of our world, or arguing that God has distanced himself from commanding humanity and has instead put two pieces in place to guide us. The ability to think, that's the intellectual side, and our need for physical and emotional nourishment. So it's not God says this, God says that. And she saw a lot of that in Orthodox Catholicism. And I think that's one reason she backed away from it. She was too much of an autonomous mind to just say, okay. So she believed that that was part of her nature, part of all of our nature. To think. To think. We were given minds to think. And she also explores the concept of what she called sacred longing. Our search for beauty in a world which is driven by this underlying desire to get back to something. Freud said we all wanted to get back to mother. Okay? This position takes it a step further back. We all want to get back to the beginning, the creator, if you want to use that terminology. That's our longing. And when we come into the world, we're separate. We try to cling to mother as a substitute for a certain period of time. Then we cling to other things, then we cling to other things, then we cling to other things. But deep down, she says, we all want that original unity, which the mystics claim they experience. And when they experience it, they say, nothing better. It's that deep, deep longing that nothing transient can fulfill. She speaks about this. And here the theme of prayer for her becomes paramount. She states that one loves God by praying to God. Because when one prays, one empties oneself, fixes one's whole gaze towards God. Now, I think you could interpret this as a Buddhist meditation as well. You empty yourself. And when you empty, see, it's such a powerful notion of emptying. We don't like, the word empty is usually not a positive word for us, is it? If my glass is empty. But that's the only way, she says, you can fill it up with something worthwhile. So there has to be that emptiness. And that's what prayer is about, she says. It's not about asking for things. It's about emptying yourself so that you can receive the grace. She says, similarly, people can love their neighbors only when they empty themselves. The very fact that you're doing something for someone else means you're partially emptying yourself. So this notion of emptying is a constant theme. And moreover, and this is important, I think, to receive one's neighbor in what she says, all their naked truth. Not just the good guys. Not just the friendly neighbors. All neighbors in their naked truth. Because we all have naked truths. And I'll finish up here. She likewise explains that there are 3 forms of implicit love of God. 1, love of neighbor. 2, love of the beauty of the world. And 3, this is an interesting one, love of religious ceremonies. By loving these 3 objects, she says, one indirectly loves God. Love of neighbor occurs when the strong treat the weak as equals. That was a powerful theme for her. When people give personal attention to those that otherwise seem invisible, anonymous, or non-existent. And when people look at and listen to the afflicted as they are, without explicitly thinking about God. That is, when God in us, as she says, loves the afflicted rather than people loving them in God. In other words, love the afflicted for who they are, not because we see someone we've been told to do that. It's pure love. She says, love for the beauty of the world occurs when humans imitate God's love for the entire creation. Just as God creatively renounced his command over the world, letting it be ruled by human autonomy, humans need to give up, and this is important, their imaginary command over the world. Seeing the world no longer as if they, that's the species, were the world's center. Finally, when it comes to religious ceremonies, she says, this is an implicit love of God when religious practices are pure. And they're pure when that religious practice removes yourself from yourself. And she sees this from a Christian point of view. Where do you see this? The Eucharist. That's what the Eucharist is all about. You are taking the body and blood into you, and in the process emptying yourself to receive it. She says that is one of the aspects that is so moving. And I think that's important because if you've ever studied other religions, you can study the books and you can look at the ideas, but go and see how they experience and ritualize and worship together. That's when you'll get a feeling of what that religion is about. Not just reading books and listening to lectures, but actually going to a mosque and experiencing that. Going to a Hindu temple and experiencing that. Going to a Catholic Mass and experiencing that. And when it's pure, she says, you'll know it. It's something you will feel rather than think. So those are the things. Okay, a very complicated person, died very young. When I was thinking of who I would choose, I knew that I would choose a couple people that everyone knew. But I thought it might be interesting to include someone like this, who most people have not heard of, probably never will read, but a very fascinating individual from my perspective, some very interesting religious insights, and in my way of looking at things, very close to being what I would call a true Christian. I'm not trying to judge who is and who isn't a Christian, but getting away just from institutionalized to the core of how she saw God, Jesus, suffering, the world, and what to do about it, and if necessary, to give it all up. And that's the hard part, right? That's the hard part. She never said publish these books because her books were actually a way of speaking to herself. Books are often that, we think of writing books for other people, but at this level, you're writing it for, I think she's thinking out her religiosity through her works and pouring out her emotion into them as well. Pouring out her emotion. Okay, I've taken you over 10 minutes more than I should, but thanks for being here. Next week, it's going to be someone you all, Eleanor Roosevelt. I should say, a very controversial woman, if you talk about controversy, but a part that a lot of people don't realize, a very religious woman. That's often left out in her biographies, or it isn't focused on, because you always focus on the political, but she had a very deep religious belief, and a very fascinating, interesting person in her own right, not just as First Lady. Okay, see you then.